Hi, folks. Welcome to a short session. We're very fortunate. I've just returned with my colleague here from the Asia Pacific National Security Conference, and Jim Boutilier, a professor, but has been a long-time special advisor to the Admiral of Maritime Command, has agreed to join us for a few minutes and talk about the emerging issues, not just national security, but emerging issues that will likely impact on Canada and Canadian businesses. And so I thought it was an opportune time to bring Jim over for a few minutes and just have a bit of a dialogue. Jim, welcome.
Thank you very much, Terry. Delighted to be here.
Thank you. I'm glad you took a few minutes with us. Jim, what would you say would be the major emerging issues that Canadian business, Canadian government, policy decision makers, specifically the focus on the Pacific Rim, Asia-Pacific area, should be concerned about today?
Well, I think one of the fundamental structural problems, Terry, is that Canada is trifurcated in the sense that its ethnic and organizational roots lead back across the Atlantic. Its economic roots lie north and south. Mm-hmm. And in many ways, the Asia-Pacific region is a sort of afterthought. Even though we're Asianizing major urban settings in Canada at a remarkable rate as a result of our immigration policy, Ottawa, I think, has failed in many ways to come to grips with the sheer magnitude and speed of the Asian phenomenon. When you think that within the space of 25 years, the world's center of economic gravity has shifted from the Atlantic to the Pacific, this is a phenomenon of enormous magnitude. And many decision makers, I think, have not come to grips with this paradigm and what this means. Now, within that context, I think that there's a widespread feeling that the United States is in a state of decline, perhaps only relative decline, and the decline process may be extended, but that China is an emerging regional power and potentially a superpower. The growth of the Chinese economy has been nothing short of stellar. At no time in human history has an economy grown at such speed and for such a prolonged period. One of the questions, of course, parenthetically, is how long will they be able to sustain that growth trajectory? What does that mean for Canadian businesses eager to penetrate the Chinese market? And it's a difficult market to penetrate. Japan, a traditional beachhead for Canadian businesses, is in a state of structural stasis, stagnation. It has been for the better part of 20 years. And of course, the recent tragedies that have befallen Japan in terms of the great earthquake and tsunami have in fact increased Japan's burden. States like South Korea are robust and offer real opportunities, as do the states of Southeast Asia. But it's imperative that Ottawa devote a good deal of time and energy to trying to set the stage for Canadian business in Asia.
Let me just tell you, during the conference today, you talked a bit about North Korea and Kim Jong-il and the situation there. Should Canadians be concerned about the stability of Kim Jong-il and son to follow? Is that likely to impact on Canada and Canadian business?
Well, that's an interesting question because technically, and perhaps one could argue that it's a narrow technicality, Canada is still at war with North Korea. There never was a peace treaty at the end of the Korean War in 1953. Ceasefire, but never a peace treaty. So we have, of course, a considerable concern about stability on the Korean Peninsula. So far, I think it could be said that the North Korean regime, while highly provocative and in some cases unpredictable, has never pushed to the point where outright hostilities are a possibility. But it has in fact engaged in outright active war with the sinking of the South Korean corvette in March of 2010. And there's always the possibility of war by inadvertence. The stakes would be extraordinarily high. The North Koreans would not prevail in the final analysis, but it would certainly wreak devastation on South Korea. So there's always a possibility that Canadian businesses could be sideswiped seriously if there were difficulties on the peninsula.
Yeah, we watch China with some interest, the way it's growing, and it's exerting its position on the world stage. It's shoving America slightly to the side. And that's forecasted to grow to some extent. We see in Canada, our concern is Canada's Great North and the assets up there, and they've sailed their research ships several times through Canada's north without asking or talking about permission, just take it as an international waterway, and doing that. They've asked to join the Arctic Council as a member there. They're pushing hard to gather stature and position and some center of that world stage that we talk about. And I see that in the Chinese sovereign wealth funds and what they're doing there. Can you share any thoughts you have about how they're using these trillions of dollars they've got from the Americans by funding their spending spree? Now, what are they doing with that money?
Let me speak for a moment about the Arctic, because I think that's critical, and then I will come to the sovereign wealth funds. I think the Chinese have a genuine interest in the resource potential of the Arctic. One of the things that we see is there's a major delta, a major gulf between energy requirements and energy availability in China. And in the past decade, the Chinese have diversified sources of oil and gas around the world. I would also say that China, as the most active non-Arctic nation in the Arctic, is genuinely interested in the Arctic as the canary in the coal mine, in the sense that China is going to be severely affected by climate change. And we can already see this in diminished water supplies and so forth in China, which will affect their GDP. So they're monitoring the Arctic to get a feel for what may be happening downstream in China. Now let me turn to sovereign funds, and there's actually a connection between my earlier comments on sovereign funds. As you're well aware, the Chinese have been successful in assembling more than $2 trillion in foreign exchange as a result of their highly successful export-led activities across the Pacific and into Europe. And they have begun to hive off elements of that in an effort to achieve higher returns on that invested money. One of the deep structural problems facing the Chinese leadership, I would suggest, Terry, is that they're concerned about the growing asymmetry in terms of wealth distribution within China. So I think you'll find that they're going to begin using some of this enormous reserve to try to encourage infrastructural development and the spread of wealth into the rather thinly inhabited but infinitely poor parts of central and western China.
I read a paper on that the other day. They said that they're building 35 million low-priced homes for these folks. There's 28% unemployment in the rural area. All those things are coming to pass.
Well, that's certainly true. A couple of things to comment there, Terry, in the sense that about every 30 months or so, China adds a population equal to the whole of Canada. So you can imagine what the infrastructural challenge is. And further, what we see, I think, is that there are tens of millions, hundreds of millions moving off the countryside into the cities of China. So city growth will be phenomenal over the next 35 years or so, and that will absorb a good deal of China's revenue. And also we can see that city dwellers have a higher climate change imprint or footprint than people who are urban, or rather rural dwellers. So we're going to have some interesting feedback relationships between trying to redistribute wealth in China, encourage urbanization, and also deal with the fact that urban dwellers have this higher greenhouse gas footprint. So that's where some of the revenue is going to go. And also, when we come back for a moment to the environment, we can see that the Chinese are increasingly candid about the fact that climate change elements, whether it's desertification or lack of potable water and so on and so forth, probably are constraining the GDP by a couple of percentage points. And this is likely to get even greater. So they'll need all the revenue they can get. One final point to make, and that's that in 2011, 2012, China crosses the great threshold in the sense that the labor force begins to age.
Yeah.
And so the old saying, will China get rich before it gets old? And one is inclined to think that it's going to get old before it gets rich, because even the richest parts of China only have a GDP per capita roughly equal to Romania.
Well, what's the significance of the one-child policy of males only over there, and what you just said about the demographic shift?
Yes, this is a critical policy decision, and one that the Chinese are beginning to regret, I think, quite severely. It was understandable, I think, in the 1970s when it was introduced because of demographic projections. But now you have some curious, indeed even serious anomalies, in the sense that depending on the source that you turn to, there are anywhere between 25 and 40 million men in China without corresponding women. And this is in many ways an invitation to major social instability, which is one of the things that keeps the elderly leadership in Beijing awake at night. They're terrified of social instability, particularly with the multiplying effect of social network communications devices.
So the Falun Gong paled in its numbers compared to those numbers.
Oh, absolutely and utterly. And the other demographic issue, of course, is the aging of society, because if you look at the Indian labor force and the Chinese labor force, and many journalistic accounts tend to conflate these two countries, you'll see that India is infinitely better positioned because its labor force will continue to climb constructively for decades to come, whereas in the Chinese case, the labor force ages, and there is, as you can appreciate, an absolute poverty of social welfare systems to look after the aged. And indeed, there was a curious, even bizarre regulation or assertion by the authorities in China recently that it was the legal responsibility of children to look after the elders. Now, I mean,
the law.
in a society like China, where it goes without saying that children must look after their elders, this is a rather interesting assertion by the authorities.
Yeah, that's their social safety net.
Absolutely.
Social safety net. Just hold for a second. I had a thought that escaped me to catch up with Jim on one other thing. Oh yeah, good. All set?
Yeah.
Jim, during the course of our conversation, you just mentioned the aspect of China's going to need these resources for its purposes to grow its own internal economy and internal purchasers for its products. How concerned should the West and America in particular be that on the 1st and 15th, when America says it sells its treasury bills to fund its liabilities, it turns in large part to the Chinese, to the Japanese, and to a string of Middle Eastern countries to buy its paper. With the Middle East in turmoil we see, with the Japanese needing its resources now for its own issues at home, and what you just said, how concerned should Canadian business be for the U.S. vehicle currency, the American dollar, and its strength and its future in the very near term, if that is true, that the Chinese are going to need all these resources for their own purposes?
Well, there are a number of elements that you've covered, Terry. To begin with, of course, the Chinese self-evidently do hold a lot of U.S. paper. But it's not in their interests to, in fact, begin cashing that in, because it'll drive down the value of the dollar and thus undermine the value of their holdings. So they're a bit like mountain climbers strapped together on the north face of the Eiger. As long as they're together, they can support one another. Once one falls, they both fall. So that's one issue that I think needs to be borne very much in mind. Yes, the Japanese economy is in trouble, and they have huge burdens of debt, but almost all the debt, as you can appreciate, is held by Japanese nationals and not by those.
Unlike America.
That's right. The demand for natural resources in China is virtually insatiable. In fact, in the next 30 years, probably 70% of all the energy requirements on the face of the earth will be driven by China.
Great opportunities for Canada, oil sands.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we need desperately, I think, to resolve the difficulties associated, whether engineering or otherwise, of building the pipeline out to Kitimat to begin addressing. And that fits very neatly with China's diversification strategy that I referred to a moment ago, to get oil from Angola, from Venezuela, from the Middle East, and now from Western Canada. But it's not just oil and gas, it's coal, although the Chinese have certain types of coal, very productive, incidentally, of climate change gases, but it's things like cement. Some years ago, China was consuming 50% of all the cement on the face of the earth. Nickel, copper, and we could go on, and of course potash from places like Saskatchewan. So in many cases, the demands for continued growth in China will in fact benefit natural resource producers, renewable resource producers like the timber industry in British Columbia. So,
but Jimmy, you raised another question with that. It seems to me that if that is true, what's America's position on that? All of a sudden, America's had the Monroe Doctrine, has a manifest destiny. It's North American energy policy, it's North American water policy. They just take it as a given that this great white north is somehow interconnected in part. And when these pipelines start going, instead of north-south, start going east-west, what's the American position on that going to be?
Well, I think that there are several issues at stake here, Terry, in the sense that one of the developments that the Chinese leadership has been promoting, and indeed they are under a lot of pressure from the international community to do this, is to develop their domestic economy. Hitherto, it's been largely an export-led economy. And the 1908-1909 global downturn came as something of a shock to Chinese long-term planners in the sense that they realized they might not be able to rely on that, and that it was best that they develop as a hedge their own domestic economy. Now, were this to happen, we would see perhaps something of a reversal in the flow of goods now from the United States to China rather than from China to the United States. So that's one issue at hand. I think that pressure will mount on Ottawa, inexorable pressure will mount on Ottawa from the United States for some sort of water sharing policy. And indeed, globally, we're going to see water as a major showstopper in terms of interstate relations. And within a state like China, we're going to see that the available water from the Tibetan Plateau will continue to shrink. Indeed, some time ago, 3,500 hydrologists met in Beijing and concluded, among other things, that within the next 35 years, Beijing would no longer be viable as the national capital because of the falling water table in northern China. So it's not just a North American issue with the huge consumption of water in places like California and the near disappearance of the Colorado River, but it's going to be a major structural challenge for the Chinese. And what is the impact of that challenge on economic vitality? Are we looking at a point where in the next 10 years the economic trajectory begins to flatten? It'll be still perhaps impressive by global standards, but it won't be spectacular as it's been over the last 30 years. So,
Jim, let me push you a little bit on this, if I can.
Yeah.
You travel with some regularity to China. Indeed, I think tomorrow morning you're heading out for China for another conference.
Indeed.
And Michael Porter talks in terms of reasons why nations are competitive, and one of his model talks in terms of factor endowments, the idea of the lumber and things we talked about, but also advanced factor endowments, the infrastructure we have, the internet, the technology, the intermodal transportation systems, etc. What's your sense when you go to Shanghai and Beijing compared to Vancouver and Toronto, etc.? Are we keeping up?
No, we're not keeping up. And in fact, if you go to a place like Shanghai, it makes you realize that Vancouver is like Port Alberni. I mean, the sheer scale. If you go to Singapore, it's 24 million TEUs, the 20-foot equivalent unit containers, compared with 2.7 million in Vancouver. So there is an enormous scale at which things operate in Asia, and the speed and magnitude of developments is truly astonishing. Now, of course, Shanghai and Beijing are only shop windows on the world. They're not representative of China. They're, when you think that 700 or more million Chinese live on $2 a day, we realize that we're confronted with a curious phenomenon of a state which is enormously powerful but remarkably poor. And the Chinese are addressing the problem of aging infrastructure. They have a pretty spectacular high-speed train network program that they're unfolding. They're building roads. They have a riverine system, of course, but some would say that they're putting too much money into infrastructure and not enough, for example, into tertiary education, because there's a deep concern about the quality of university work research in China, which will be one of the requirements if China is to take off beyond the point where it's simply exploited the elasticity of cheap labor. They're going to have to be innovative, and their record in terms of things like Nobel Prizes or patents and so on is pretty modest by Western standards. So this may be a sort of intellectual constraint in terms of continued economic growth.
Am I being too pessimistic? We came out of World War II, a full member of the G7, fourth largest navy in the world. Truly were a member of the G7. We had the economy to prove it. But we've cascaded down to about 14th position if measured by GNP. Are we doomed to keep on sliding and cascading down with the Brazils and the other BRIC nations percolating and coming on? What's your sense of that?
Well, I'm inclined to be a bit like Chicken Little, that the sky is going to fall in the sense that I think in absolute terms we do a pretty good job, and we're breathtakingly lucky to be Canadians in almost any sense of the word. But I think that in many cases we're asleep at the switch. I often maintain to audiences that out there is a world that's going to eat us alive and will give us no quarter, and there's no reason why it should. And that bit by bit there are termites in the woodwork that we will continue to keep sliding downwards as other states that are more aggressive commercially and otherwise begin to overhaul us. So now, a countervailing argument, Terry, I would suggest, and I'm being partly facetious, is that by 2030 we'll be the only people in town with wood, water, and wheat. And these will be international currencies, seriously. And so it may be that we'll stumble backwards into victory like Flashman, the fictional hero. But yeah, I agree with you. I think that we have been lulled into a sense of false security. Canada is a wonderful nation, and we fail to appreciate that bit by bit we're beginning to move towards a European standard of living.
You moved me to one of my concluding questions, I guess, Jim, might be that given we have the second largest landmass in the world and this very small and destined to remain very small population of 30, maybe rising to 50 million people, sitting on, as you say, the commodities, the measure of exchange, how realistic that we're going to expect to be able to hold on to that?
Well,
and let me a supplemental question.
Yeah.
And should we consider finding a partner right now and being a junior partner where we can bring somebody in or a cluster of folks in to be the senior partner and to protect us?
Interesting and provocative question, Terry. I mean, to what degree should we think seriously about the declining relative position of the United States, to which we're intimately connected financially and in a whole array of other ways? Are we in effect the junior partner for USA Inc.? Should we be thinking in European terms, that is to say, should we be creating, and we've already begun to move down that road in a way, should we be thinking of the sort of North American free trade area where in effect there's hardly any boundary to speak of between the United States and Canada, and we become, for all intents and purposes, Upper Pennsylvania. But then again, we tend to denominate ourselves as Canadians in anti-American terms, that we're not American, rather than denominating ourselves in the ways that we are Canadians. So politically it may not be viable to have a sort of resource sharing in which the utilization of the resources was highly asymmetric, and we would see ourselves being denuded in terms of water or wood or wheat simply to feed the United States. The sort of World War II or pre-World War II military occupation of Canada I don't think is on the books, but we are, I think, standing into an increasingly Darwinian period. Global climate change is going to have a dramatic effect, perhaps even a devastating effect on many nations in Africa and elsewhere. So the demands on us, humanitarian in terms of food stocks and so on, I think are going to climb. And Ottawa will find that I think its agenda will be constricted by the fact that we'll be moving increasingly into an age of scarcity, resource scarcity, and an age in which the demands of the international community on us will rise, as we're seen to be one of the few nations that really are in a position, nominally at least, to help the rest.
Good. We'll just pause there for a second. I'm just going to close off with you now, Jim, unless you have some of the points you want to raise.
No, this is good.
I think what I'd like to get out of this is to tie it in for our students, the grad students of the array I talked about. I think what you're going to recommend or suggest to them, the importance of them being a futurist, the importance of them looking out in front, being anticipatory of what's coming down at them because of this seismic transformational shift that's taking place. They've got to start thinking about it, not just do the sleepwalk into the dance and wake up and say, whoops, what's happened?
Absolutely.
So I'm going to ask you that type of question.
Yeah.
To jump in.
Yeah.
Are we all set, Dave? Good. Well, Jim, I want to conclude our few minutes together today, if I can, and simply ask you again for our students who are watching this, graduate students in a variety of different programs, how important is it that they be a futurist, that they take what's on the front page and what's in the business section and merge them and give some reflective thoughts and critical thinking to that so they can position Canada, their business, and their families to react to these seismic transformational shifts that you've talked about today?
Well, I think that's an excellent point. I think for a long time we enjoyed the luxury of denominating our national interests from coast to coast. That once we went to the low water mark, that's really where Canada's national interests ended. But now, voluntarily or involuntarily, we have become a global nation. We have to think globally. And it is absolutely, utterly imperative for graduate students, those moving on to the professions or into business, to begin thinking outside the box. And I mean genuinely outside the box, because we are faced with a series of existential threats. And I can't underscore that sufficiently. These are existential threats which will change the way in which we do business, the way in which we live, what our national prospects are. Climate change, I think, is a genuine concern. And the thing that really worries me, Terry, is that these phenomena are unfolding at enormous speed, way inside the normal decision-making curve of governments. And I see little, if any, resolve for the moment at the national level to address these major threats. So it will be absolutely, utterly imperative for students that come out of the Royal Roads University program to really begin thinking about what does the future hold in store, how can you position yourself, how can the nation position itself, because there'll be a real premium on leadership and on effective and aggressive, and I mean aggressive in the best sense of the word, action in order to safeguard what we have here in Canada.
Good. Jim, thanks. It's nice roll first to get together for a minute.
Delighted.
Folks, we've had a wonderful day today with a futurist, Dr. James Boutilier, who's taken a few moments to join us. I hope you've enjoyed the conversation. Talk to you next time.